Penguin. Okay, so just so I kind of have a feel of the room, how many of you guys have debated before? How many of you guys have spent more than an hour at a time researching? Okay, the majority of you, good. A lot of you will probably not be too surprised by what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's still good to hear. So the first place that you need to start when you're looking at a new resolution is by taking the resolution as a whole. You don't want to start by writing a case. You want to start by understanding the topic that you are going to be talking about all year. Some of the most impressive debate teams that I've been around really understand the entire context of the resolution, not just their specific case. If you have background on it, I'm actually going to take off my jacket. If you have background on it, your debate will be at a much higher level than the majority of other competitors. So a good way to think about this is the 90-10-10 rule. 100% of what you read is useful. 90% will be valuable reading that you won't necessarily cut or use in round. 10% will be evidence that you cut and actually put into a brief format, and 10% of that 10% that you cut is actually what you'll use in round. The last time I debated, my partner and I had 2 full boxes of briefs, and we used probably about 4 briefs total in one tournament that we went to, because we just didn't use most of them because we didn't feel like it. And it was still valuable research because we knew what we were talking about, but it was not something that we were necessarily using in round. A good way to do this is to read a lot. One thing that I like to do is make a library trip. Basically what I mean by that is go to your local library and scan lots and lots and lots of pages of books. You don't necessarily need to be reading it right off the cuff. If I use Evernote, so I take pictures of books and file them. But if you go to the library and get books on the background of the topic, then you'll have a much better chance of actually understanding the topic area. How many of you guys are NCFCA topic this year? Okay, and how many of you are STOA? Okay. This is just for policy. I'm going to talk from a policy perspective because that's where I'm from. For policy for the Middle East specifically, there's tons and tons of background material that you all need to be looking into. Like, you need to understand the history from the Ottoman Empire. You need to understand the backstory of a lot of different countries involved in the Middle East. That'll be really crucial to you all competing well this year, which, yeah, that's kind of my second point. Know the background information. If you know the background information and why something is the way it is, you will have a much easier time debating against cases that you don't necessarily have a brief against. So it's valuable research, even if you're not cutting cards from a specific book.
And if you're an LDer, you're not excused from knowing how to research. You still need to understand how to research to be an effectively conducted debater.
Yeah.
Even if you guys don't use cards every round or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. And what that means for a lot of you guys is like reading the original philosopher and like the entirety of his work, not just looking up quotes that he said. Okay, the next thing is adjusting your perspective. A lot of times it's very easy to kind of argue from what we believe and say that I believe this, therefore I am right, and then find evidence to fit what you're trying to say. The better perspective is to generate arguments based on the research that you find, not based on what you necessarily want to argue, but what other people believe is right and what research you have actually supports that position. So yeah, the goal needs to be generating arguments based on research, not making evidence fit into arguments that you already came up with. The best way to ensure that is to re-educate yourself on the topic every once in a while. So that's conquering the resolution. I like the penguin because penguins, but chilling out and reading is honestly the best way to get started on the debate topic, especially for NCFCA this year, also for electronic surveillance. Okay, primary versus secondary sources. So when you look at Google, you're going to see a lot of different types of material. A primary source is the original study or author. That means the legal document or the peer-reviewed journal article that is the origin of this information. A secondary source is another source that's quoting the original primary source. So basically we're talking about degrees of separation. A primary source is obviously more credible than a secondary source, but a primary source is generally much harder to understand. They'll be speaking in language that really only experts in the field understand, so that can be hard for a layman to understand. So the secondary source can be really useful in that context. Hearsay or tertiary, you guys should basically never be using this. This is WorldNet Daily quoting a guy who read something that someone else said. Basically, we're getting farther and farther away from the origin of the information, and just like the telephone game, the information gets perverted each time that it's passed on. And learning basic journalism standards like presenting 2 credible sources is always a good idea when you're talking about researching. If you guys can find one person that advocates an idea, great. If you can find 2, even better. My personal favorite is bipartisan support. If you can find 2 people from opposite political parties that support an idea, you know that it's probably one of the better ideas that can be presented in a debate round. So that's primary, secondary, and tertiary or hearsay sources. You guys should really mostly be quoting primary sources, especially in policy if you can, but it can be really challenging. It's always important to understand like the facts behind a primary source, but it's okay to quote the secondary source. Okay. So next we get to talk about evidence. There's lots of different types of evidence. What I'll be talking about specifically is cutting cards or research that you did. Logic is obviously a form of evidence. Did you guys get that lecture? All the different types of evidence? No? Okay, well there's lots of different types of evidence besides just research, but that's kind of what I'll be talking about here. Okay. So a couple different types. Logic, really, really useful if you're creating just a logical structure, if it's something that doesn't really need too much support, if it's something that the common man would agree with. The best uses for logic-based evidence is topicality or common sense disadvantages. How many of you guys have run an argument that you didn't have evidence supporting? How many of you guys have been confident in that argument? Good portion of you. How many of you guys have won a round on an argument that you didn't have evidence for? Okay, so there's a little bit fewer of you guys. You should be winning rounds on logic-based argumentation because it's the most structured, it's the most clear piece of argumentation that you can do. The news sources, those are a little bit different. You should be quoting news sources if you're dealing with a topic that's constantly changing. I don't know, Middle East for sure, you're going to be quoting a lot of news sources. Electronic surveillance, probably not quite as much, but as things change very quickly, it's important to have up-to-date information. The best use for that is honestly to keep up to date, like I said, but the worst use is advocacy, or basically quoting a news source like it's an expert on the topic. Don't do that, it's a bad thing. The pros of news sources is that they sometimes do quote experts and you can get really recent examples, which is really useful when you're dealing with a constantly changing environment. The cons is that there's very limited credibility and there's a lot of bias. If you're quoting Fox News, you're probably going to get the conservative viewpoint. If you're quoting CNN, for example, you'll probably get the more liberal viewpoint. You have to take that into account, and there's credibility that's lost by the partisan bias that's involved. Yeah, do use them, but choose wisely who you're quoting, and don't use them as a sole or primary source. It's basically all things in moderation is the thesis behind this. Okay, think tanks. These are really fun because lots of people decide that think tanks are the best advocates that you can have for a specific plan or a specific idea, mostly because they generally agree with one or the other. So the pros with think tanks is that there's lots of advocacy and educational articles and they're relatively credible. It's a really great place to look at and find a specific mandate that needs to be passed or find a specific advocate that agrees with your plan. But the problem is that there's a lot of bias and they're not peer reviewed. So in a peer review process, you have an expert write an article and then it's reviewed by other people in the field, other experts in the field, and basically approved as being credible. Think tank articles are not peer reviewed. They're basically created in order to prove a point without that point actually being evaluated for truth. They're much more partisan based as opposed to actually being in search of the facts. Definitely use think tanks, but in moderation once again. You need to also do your homework. When you're quoting a think tank, make sure you know their position on certain issues and also make sure that you understand where their funding come from, who they're writing for, how credible they are in the context. If you're going to quote a think tank, be careful about it and make sure that you can defend the credibility of that think tank. And yeah, use in moderation. That's kind of the point behind every one of these types of different sources is use in moderation. You shouldn't be solely relying on any particular form of evidence except for maybe the next one, which is law reviews and journals. This is personal favorite. Law reviews and journals are fantastic. Have any of you guys ever used LexisNexis? A couple of you guys? Okay. We'll talk about that later, but if you can get your hands on law reviews, that is the best form of evidence that you can find because it's a combination of primary sources, secondary sources. It also has lots of specific advocacy. Just beautiful. The pros is that they're very credible, they're peer-reviewed, and they tend to be really, really helpful articles. The peer review process is a really, really important fact to remember about law reviews. The cons is that it can be complex or abstract. Yeah, you'll run into really, really complicated theories in law reviews, but they can be easily avoided. I've even read a lot of articles from law reviews that I didn't necessarily understand, but still found useful information in. Just because you may not be understanding exactly what the author's saying doesn't mean that whatever they're saying is entirely useless to you. Definitely use law reviews and journals to research the broad topic as well. Like I was saying earlier, this is a great place to find broad background information on a specific topic and use them across the board. You can use law reviews or journals to support almost any argument that you want to make. Books. Books are really great. I think it's like 80%, upwards of 80% of all information that we have still isn't online, something like that. But 87% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So the pros of books is that there's lots of background information, very worth the library trip, and the cons is that they can be really outdated. It's really unfortunate to pick up a book and start reading it and like be totally digging whatever they're saying and be like, yeah, this is great, and then realize the book's from like 87. Like, can't really quote that anymore. But the information is still useful, as I was saying. Any research that you do will not harm you. Research can only help you. Okay. Google Books is good. They tend to be a little bit more up-to-date, or it's easier to find up-to-date information on Google Books. The pros are the same as books, plus you don't have to spend the gas money to go to the library. The cons is that you can only get a couple pages at a time, and oftentimes if you're reading a paragraph, it'll split off in the middle of the paragraph and you can't get the next page. So I would use Google Books to kind of map out what books you want to read and then maybe invest in actually buying that book from Google Books. I've done that before, and it's been really, really helpful if you really are tracking with what an author is saying. It's worth the money.